Hi, this is an introduction to philosophy where we engage in some of the ultimate questions that philosophers ask. My name is Mark Thorsby, and this week we've been looking at the question regarding what is consciousness or what is the mind. And today's session is titled, What is it like to be a bat? We're going to be talking about an essay that comes from philosopher Thomas Nagel today. So welcome back, everyone, and I hope you guys are doing well. If you've been following along in our series, our last video here was on the question of the role of the mind, and we looked at artificial intelligence. And we discovered, after looking at first Alan Turing's essay on computing machines and the articulation of the Turing test, we discover a possible test for determining whether or not a machine or perhaps another being is conscious. We then looked at John Searle's account of the Chinese room argument, in which he problematizes the use of the Turing test and ultimately articulates a further condition that would be necessary when we talk about the mind, and that's the condition of intentionality. So in this video, we're moving ahead, and we're not going to be talking about artificial intelligence, but we're still looking at this question of the mind, and in particular, we'll be asking whether or not the mind can be reduced to the brain, whether or not the mind is nothing more than a physical entity that we call the brain. So we'll be looking at, so this lecture is entitled, What is this that I am? Because after all, when I say I am, I'm meaning the sense of my identity in the Cartesian sense of the cogito, right? I think, therefore I am. So I know that I have a mind because I have this sort of subjective experience of the world and myself in the world. But what exactly is this that I am? Am I just a physical mind? And we'll see that Thomas Nagel sort of approaches this question brilliantly by asking the question, well, what is it like to be a bat? Because if I am just a physical brain, if that's all I really am, then I should be able to give a physical account of a brain in order to answer the question, what is it that I am? But if I ask, what is it like to be a bat, I can give plenty of physical articulations of a bat, but that doesn't give me any closer to understanding what consciousness for a bat, qua consciousness of a bat, is like. So that may not make sense in terms of the way I just explained it, but it will as we go through this video. So welcome back, everyone. I hope you're doing well. And I want to start here today with a thought experiment called, often referred to here as the red rose thought experiment. And it's pretty important for what we're thinking about in terms of physicalism. Now, I'll be defining physicalism in a couple screens from here, so we'll come to that. But for now, just think of physicalism as the idea, as the position that all explanations, all true explanations, must be physical explanations. So let's think about consciousness, and let's think about our experience, for instance, of a red rose. Now, as a thought experiment, I want you to imagine a possible state of affairs. Let's imagine, for instance, that there's a woman, and she's a color scientist. She has a PhD in color science, which means that she knows everything there is to know about color. That is, its physical properties, right? It's a certain wavelength of spectrums of light and so on and so forth. And let's imagine that this woman's living in a house. The house, though, is completely gray, right? She's never left the house, which means that she's never seen the color gray, right? Even though Nagel doesn't actually give this example, but it's a very famous problem for physicalists. Let's imagine that, for instance, that she's taken all of her classes on color science online through a computer screen that's black and white, though, right? So she knows all of the physical explanations regarding color, but she's never seen a color. She's never seen the color red. Now let's imagine that one day she goes outside for the first time in her life. She opens the door, sort of like Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz, and opens up to a world of color. And she steps outside, and lo and behold, in her garden is a red rose. And I've sort of put a picture up here for you to take a look at. And let's imagine that for the first time in her life, she sees the red rose. She has a conscious, personal experience of the red rose. And here's my question for you to ponder. Does the color scientist gain any new knowledge by the experience of the color red, as opposed to all of the things she knows about, all of the science she knows about red? And you can see here to ask yourself, does she gain any new knowledge? She already knew all of the science and all the physical properties there is to know about the color red, but we're sort of pulled in this direction of thinking, well, wait a second. If she sees red for the first time, there is something new in that experience. But whatever it is that's new in that experience doesn't seem reducible to physical properties, or physicalism doesn't seem sufficient to explain the newness of the experience red versus her oldness of the science of red. So sort of imagine, and you can, and by the way, there's been volumes and reams of papers written on this very problem. So I'm not going to tell you what way is the right answer here, but I want you to see here this red rose problem. I encourage you to pause the video here and just think about it. And what is your view? And that'll start to give you a sense on what you already think, perhaps, regarding the physicalist hypothesis, that all explanations of consciousness not only can be, but ought to be, reduced to physical explanations, or explanations of physical phenomena and facts. So this is the red rose thought experiment. It's very interesting, and I sort of go back and forth on it myself, but I'm curious what you might say. So use this as example as a way to sort of understand what we're ultimately interested in this question in our talk today, which is whether or not our experience of conscious subjectivity can be reduced to the physical properties that, for instance, medical science or neurobiology can give us. Okay, now with that in mind, let's sort of jump into the question for today. Let's go back up here. We're supposed to start here. Today's essay, it comes from Thomas Nagel, who is a philosopher who I'll sort of give you a little bit about. He was born in 1937. He's still alive, and he's still publishing. In fact, he's still shaking up the publishing world. Here, I'll scoot this over so you can get sort of see a bad picture of him. But he teaches it. He's a professor of philosophy and law at New York University. He's taught there for a long time. His areas of specialty are actually in the philosophy of mind, where he's particularly interested in this question of consciousness, but also the role of how natural selection might be able or unable to explain consciousness. And then finally, he's also quite interested in ethics, written a lot on this. In particular, he's written on this problem of moral luck, which at some point we actually are discussing in this class, though we're not going to be reading his essay of the same title. But he's also interested in this question between subjectivity and objectivity, and subjective and objective reason. Though we'll see today that he's not talking about subjective and objective reasoning. He does make this distinction between that he thinks that at the core of the problem is this distinction between the subjective and the objective. And finally, he also writes quite a bit on political philosophy. Hence, he is a professor of law as well. So now, he has many key books and essays. Of course, the essay we're looking at here, What Is It Like to Be a Bat, is right up there at the top of the list in terms of works he's well known for. He also wrote a great essay on the philosophy of war, entitled War and Massacre. So if you're interested in the ethics of war, I encourage you to look at Nagel's work as well. Now, some important key works here is Mortal Questions. This is actually a selection of some of his most important essays. I think it includes this essay as well. I would encourage those of you who are interested in Nagel's work to start with that book. It's a great book. Also, The View from Nowhere from 1986. Equality and Partiality, very interesting, especially when we think of a philosopher we're going to look at later, and that is Immanuel Kant and his ethics. We'll reference back to that book. And then finally, Mind and Cosmos, which was just published in 2012 and has really shaken up the philosophical world, or at least it's shaken up readers of Nagel, and as a result, it's about consciousness and cosmology and evolutionary biology. And as a result, Nagel is arguing in that book that Darwinian natural selection is insufficient to explain the phenomena of consciousness. So this most recent book is related to what we're talking about today. But I'll say this, is that many philosophers have dismissed and heavily criticized and attacked Thomas Nagel for this last text, Mind and Cosmos. It's a pretty great book, interesting. But that's a little bit about who Thomas Nagel is. But you know what? Let's jump into the essay and some of the key issues we need to be thinking about. The first issue that we have to mention here is this notion of the mind-body problem. And that's really at the core of the text we're looking at today. And so what I want to do now is jump and give you what I call a little primer on the mind-body problem, especially sort of give you sort of a historical, sort of mention a couple of the key things from regarding the history of the problem of the mind-body split, if you will. And the first thing to remember is to think back upon Descartes, and Descartes' bifurcation, as I mentioned in the previous video, and I've mentioned throughout since that video, where Descartes argues in his meditations that cogito ergo sum, and with that I think therefore I am. Descartes cements our knowledge first with our sense of subjectivity, our sense of ourselves. And then Descartes essentially tries to build a bridge from the subjectivity of the individual, from a person's own mind, ultimately and builds out to get knowledge of the world. And Descartes concludes in his sixth meditation that the mind and the body are distinct, that the mind is irreducible to the body. And this mind-body split, although many philosophers attack Descartes and certainly don't follow through with the Cartesian meditations in their own line of thinking, in many ways this mind-body split has been carried over throughout, for instance, the British empiricist. So if we look at the way that the role that the mind played in philosophers after the empiricism, for instance, we could look at John Locke, Berkeley, or Hume. We won't talk about Kant, we'll talk about him later. But if we look at these philosophers, we see that they maintain this mind-body split. For instance, John Locke, we looked at, if you go back to the video on John Locke, we saw that he maintains a model of the mind in which my mind only has indirect access to the world, right? I don't directly perceive the cup of coffee. Let's see if I can, so you can sort of see it right here. There we go. So when I look at the cup of coffee, right, the cup of coffee, the light waves go into my eyes, but my eyes somehow organize and then transmit that information to my mind or to my brain. And so all the information I have, though, is in my brain, everything I know about the world. And so I'm only indirectly seeing the coffee cup. I'm directly seeing the representation that my mind makes of the coffee shop. So this mind-body split has a huge impact in the philosophy, modern philosophy after Descartes. Now, we then moved on and we looked at Turing and Searle, and we looked at the question of artificial intelligence, in which, of course, the idea was, could we create a machine that could think, or at least simulate a mind? And of course, if that's possible, that tends towards physical-like explanations for the mind. But we saw with Searle that a consciousness became something of a problem, right? Because even if we're conscious, even if we pass the Turing test, if we're in that Chinese room, again, if you don't know what I'm talking about, watch my previous video on this topic. But in the Chinese room argument, even though I could successfully pass the Turing test by, producing correct Chinese output to other Chinese input, that doesn't mean I'm actually conscious of what's happening, because I still don't understand the Chinese characters. And there we noted the requirement that it looked like, in order to say that a machine was thinking, we'd have to be able to postulate it has some sort of intentionality. And we define intentionality really in the Husserlian framework as the directedness of consciousness. The idea I'm always conscious of something, never of everything or nothing at any one time, always only of particular modes, directionalities, right? Now, something we haven't talked about, but I have to mention here, is a famous essay by Gilbert Ryle. Now, Gilbert Ryle, he attacks this mind-body problem, this mind-body distinction, as a category mistake, right? He thinks that what happens is that we have this experience of a mind, and we have this experience of a body, and we sort of want to lay them out as fundamentally the same types of categories, right? But he thinks this is a category mistake, is that ultimately we're lost in our language to some degree. And give you an example of Gilbert Ryle's category mistake. He says, for instance, imagine Americans who go and they travel to England. They travel to Oxford, for instance, and while they're in Oxford, they ask the tourist guide, "Where's the university?" Right? And for those of you who don't know anything about Oxford University or their educational system, this may be news to you, right? Which is namely this, is that every time in America, when we think of a university, we think of a university building, right? You go to the university campus. Literally, you can go to a building that has the name, the University of such and such. Well, if you go to England, if you go to Oxford and you ask the tour guide, where's the University of Oxford or Oxford University, people are going to sort of scratch their head and be like, what are you talking about? That's because there is no Oxford University. Instead, they have a completely different system where they have multiple colleges. And when you apply to school, you apply to that college and you take all of your exams and you do all of your studies through that college. But that when you graduate from that college, you get a degree, and your degree says from the University of Oxford, right? And the idea here is that all of these colleges participate, and then all of them combined is what the Oxford University is, right? But Americans make a category mistake, right? That is, Americans take our sense of a university and try to apply it to the British system, and that's taking one category and misapplying it. In the same sense, Ryle thinks that we take our sense of the mind, and when we compare it to the body by analogy, we ultimately create a category mistake. And what this means, though, is that if the mind and the body are not categorically distinct, they're actually just different ways of talking about different parts of our experience of the world, then that means that mind and body are fundamentally the same in some sense. Now, you can see that the language of mind and body is problematic here. And this is what brings us to what we're going to call the problem of physicalism. The problem of physicalism. Whoops, there's a little mistake there. There we go. The problem of physicalism. And physicalism originally came from a group of philosophers in Austria known as the Vienna Circle. And for them, they said that expressions about mental states can be reduced to expressions about physical states. Now, strictly speaking, the Vienna Circle didn't say necessarily that the mental phenomena we experience are nothing other than physical experiences, though they implied that. They just said, for logical sake, expressions about mental states can be reduced without losing information to physical states. Now, you go to another philosopher, for instance, Herbert Fiegel, and we get a more robust sense of physicalism, and that's the idea that mental states and events are identical with neurophysiological states. And that's the idea that literally the physical chemistry of our brain is what the mental states are, and they're irreducible, right? So that's all they are, right? And so that's the notion of physicalism ultimately that Thomas Nagel is interested in thinking about and ultimately attacking. So I've sort of given us a sort of brief definition of physicalism that we can work with here. And we can say that physicalism is equal to the experience of the mind, is equal to the idea that the experience of the mind as conscious can be reduced or is identical to material and physical properties, primarily the properties of the brain. So it's basically this idea is that the brain is nothing more than, the mind is nothing more than the brain. And this is the idea of physicalism that we're after, right? So when we go to Thomas Nagel's problem here, if we return to it, we see this idea that for him, the mind-body problem seems to be such an intractable problem because of the idea of consciousness. Because it looks like there's something lost. If you go back to the red flower problem, there's something lost in the idea that consciousness can just be replaced by expressions about physical stuff, right? It looks like that the physical, the problem with the red flower example is that it looks like the color scientist has a new experience because she's having a conscious experience of red now. And in so doing, it looks like consciousness is somehow categorically distinct. So you can see here, there's this problem. So what do we mean by reductionism? Well, reductionism can be defined simply as the replacement of one expression by a second expression that differs from the first in terms of its prima facie reference. Prima facie just means on the face of it. So, for instance, if I say consciousness, there's certain references that immediately spark your attention. You're immediately thinking of psychology, and you're thinking of the mind and the experience of subjectivity and so forth. But if I say the brain, your prima facie references change. So instead of talking about the mind or something, or states of consciousness, instead I'll talk about modes, neurological structures, and I'll talk about neurobiology and so on and so forth. A different set of references, ones which we can investigate, whereas consciousness looks very difficult for scientists to investigate unless we maintain this reduction. So Nagel moves on and says, it looks like we have a weakness for the familiar, in which we tend to reduce that which is incomprehensible to a familiar analogy. And this is sort of laying out Nagel's cards. Nagel ultimately is going to argue that physicalism is a reduction that doesn't make sense. It's actually incomprehensible. He doesn't think that the physical states of affairs can explain conscious states of affairs. So here's the ultimate thesis of his article, which is we don't at present have a coherent explanation for the physical nature of the mind. Now, notice, Nagel's not denying that there's a physical nature to the mind. He's not denying there's a relationship between the brain and my conscious mind, but he's denying that we have a clear account of that relation. Okay? So that's just to be clear here, because he's not arguing necessarily that he's not arguing that I'm a soul entombed in a body or something. He's just arguing here that physicalism is insufficient to explain our experience of the mind. Okay, so let's move on here now to, oops, that's not to that spot. I'm sorry. There we go. So what I want to do now here is just run through the sort of step-by-step elements of his essay. And it really begins this question of what is consciousness. And you're going to see that he's going to say, well, in a way of sort of opening that question up for evaluation is by asking, well, what is it like to be a bat, right? Because if consciousness can be reduced to physical phenomena, and I do have a physical account of a bat's brain, its neurophysiology, then that means I should be able to explain what it's like to be a bat. But it doesn't look like that's the case, right? So we'll get to that here in just a moment. Let's just jump into the setup elements of his essay, right? And it starts off with this. Now, first off, he says our understanding here is widespread, but with little accompanying evidence, right? We understand what it's like to have a mind and to be conscious. We understand that because we are conscious, but we don't have lots of evidence to help our explanations, right? On really either side of the fence, right? So to be conscious at all seems to imply that there's something that it is like to be that organism. For instance, go back, if you will, to even Turing here, or this problem of solipsism we mentioned in our last video, and ask this question: how do I know that you are conscious, or that another person I know is conscious, right? For instance, take my son. I have a 6-year-old son. How do I know that my 6-year-old son is conscious and aware of the world? Well, it looks like the only way I know he's conscious is because of the things he does, right? The certain practices he engages in, right? Think of the beetle in the box example we talked about in our previous video. It looks like he acts in such a way that only makes sense to me because I act that way when I'm conscious. And so it looks like postulate his type of consciousness. And in that same way, I do know what it's like to be him, right? So for instance, imagine a physician could ask me, well, how's my son's name is Julian. They could say, how is Julian doing? What is it like for him? And I can imagine, I may not know what it's like to be him, but I can imagine what it's like to be him, right? And I could give an account of that. So it looks like if we say that something's conscious, we can also give an account of what it's like to be that organism. Or in other words, we can say C1 if and only if B1. So consciousness exists if and only if a state of particular being exists. This is the sort of logical formation Nagel's giving here. So consciousness in this sense becomes a subjective experience, right? Because the way in which I know that what it's like to be Julian is because it's based upon my subjective experience. Now, but wait a second. Let's think about this. That means that when I give this experience I have of consciousness is not, right, I emphasize, is not captured by certain reductive explanations. For instance, if I give an, I can give, it's, my experience of consciousness is not captured by an explanatory system of the brain, right? And if you recall, when we looked at John Searle's Chinese room argument in the previous video, we talked about the systems reply and the idea that I can give an account of an overall system of consciousness, but that doesn't explain to me the experience of consciousness, because it doesn't experience my consciousness of things as such, right? Intentionality is not captured. So explanatory systems don't meet the criteria we need here. Neither does to simply say that consciousness is a functional state, right? It's a function of the brain's, electrical engineering or something. That doesn't explain it either, right? Because just explaining the idea that consciousness is just a certain function of the brain, that doesn't explain what it's like to have the brain, right? Right? Because the experience of consciousness is not one of a function, right? If you say that consciousness is a function of the brain, that doesn't give me an inch in terms of explaining why it is I have the particular experience or the particular types of experiences I have. So he denies this possibility of the brain experience being a functional state, or at least that reductive explanation, helping us understand consciousness. He also even goes as far as to argue against this notion that it's just an intentional state. So you can see here this suggestion that we gave last time that maybe consciousness can be explained in terms of intentionality. That maybe gives us further, but it doesn't explain as a reductive explanation what consciousness is. And so he even rejects that. So in the final conclusion here, he basically says that reductionism, oops, that should be over here, right? The reductionism fails to specifically explicate a subjective experience, right? That is my own personal experience. Even this formal explanation of intentionality doesn't do that either. So he thinks that all of these reductionisms fail, right? It doesn't look like we have the proper equipment in our theories to give a satisfactory explanation, at least one that takes a sort of reductionistic approach. Okay, so let's move here down to the next section here. Let me see. I'm on the right path here. Right. So it looks like whatever account we give needs to be a phenomenological account. Now, phenomenology seeks to describe our experience of consciousness so as to determine what the eidetic or necessary structures of consciousness are. Now, phenomenology originally comes out of the work of a philosopher by the name of Edmund Husserl, and where Edmund Husserl sort of pioneered all of the stuff we're discussing, including intentionality and this sort of things, right? But Nagel's point here is that if we're going to give a satisfactory account regarding what it's like to be conscious, when we maintain that formula C if and only if B, or C1 if and only if B1, then whatever explanation we give can't just be a reductive explanation. It has to be a phenomenological explanation, or at least one that includes a phenomenological description of our experience, right? So an objective count, and the problem here is that all of these physical accounts we give, we like them because they appear to be objective, quote unquote. But the problem is these objective accounts dismiss almost uniformly phenomenological description as being important. And here we can I want to hone in on this distinction we have between the objective and the subjective. And here actually Nagel is pulling from a distinction here that comes out of the work of another existentialist phenomenologist, which is Jean-Paul Sartre, and that's the distinction between the for itself and the in itself, right? The pour soi and the in soi, right? Forgive, I don't speak French, so for those of you who do speak French, I apologize for butchering your language. I really respect French, and I don't mean to, right? So, but there's this distinction between the idea of, or at least Sartre's idea was that consciousness for itself is what we call subjective, And consciousness in itself is what we call objective, or things in themselves are objective and things for themselves are subjective, right? So when we ask the question about consciousness, if we really want a good explanation, we need to understand what it's like to be that thing. We need to understand the subjective, the link between the subjective and the objective here. Now think back of, you could think here, marginally here, about how what Nagel's arguing relates to Gilbert Ryle's category mistake discussion. So we won't get into that here, but I want you to be I want those sort of neurons, if you will, firing. I want you thinking about that question. So then Nagel moves on, and he gives this example. He says, for instance, let's take bats. Bats have sonar perception, and that's utterly unimaginable from the perception of a human being. So if the physicalist explanation or reduction is sufficient, it should be able to account for the question of consciousness in terms of the bat. That is, what is it like to be a bat? Note, I'm not asking the question what it's like to behave like a bat. I know what bats behave like. They hang from ceilings, they suck blood, or they eat insects, or whatnot, right? I can imagine what it's like to live like a bat. My question is, what is it like to be a bat? That is, what is it like to have the consciousness of a bat? The consciousness in the sense of the for itself, right? Where the bat exists for itself. What is that like? Well, here, bats don't have hearing. They have sonar. Bats do have hearing. It's sonar. They don't have eyesight, right? So I can't really imagine what it's like to live using sonar. Bats literally screech, and then based upon how quickly those screeches, refract back into their ears, that's how they calculate distance, and they travel and fly, and it all happens so quickly, I can't even imagine it. So, but of course, if I just gave a physical explanation of the bat, that doesn't answer the question at all, right? So what is it like to be a bat becomes a provocative question here for helping us get a grip on the insufficiency of physicalist-like explanations. He says the problem is akin to observing a Martian, right? What is it like to be a Martian? Imagine a Martian that has tentacles, and I have no idea what it's like, right? I could capture the Martian and dissect it, but that doesn't tell me what it's like to be a Martian, right? So what is the point here? The point is that we need to avoid cognitive dissonance here in the temptation to dismiss the experience or to dismiss the physicalism outright. Now, notice here he's saying we need to, because of this problem that the what is it like to be a bat sets up, it's easy for us to say, well, we should either just dismiss our experience or dismiss physicalism, because physicalism doesn't seem sufficient, but then again, our experience doesn't seem to be explainable in a sufficient manner either. But he says, let's avoid, there's a cognitive dissonance. These things are unclear in how they relate. But it's clear that there are physical properties in the world, and it's clear that there is an experience of consciousness. So he says, let's avoid the temptation just to dismiss one or the other, right? And instead, let's probe a little bit deeper and see what we might be able to determine. Let's make a distinction here in our conceptual schemas. We can make a distinction between facts on the one hand and our conceptual schemas on the other, right? That should be number 2, I just realized. So let's move it over. There you go. Let's make a distinction between conceptual schemas and facts, right? It's clear that the physicalism as a conceptual schema doesn't seem to be sufficient. And it's clear that I have but I do have a fact, right? So, well, let's go here. Facts, by contrast, reach beyond the mind, right? And think here about Bernard Williams is a great philosopher who's constantly in contact here with what Nagel is writing about. And Bernard Williams has this concept that he calls the absolute conception of the world. And he says, listen, we always interpret the world in certain ways, but ultimately, it's not just based upon our perspective. The problem is what's known as perspectivism, the idea that all epistemologies are perspectival or based upon perspective. And Bernard Williams wants to say, no, science gives us some sense of an absolute conception of the world. And it looks like our facts do resemble that. That looks like that some facts may actually reach beyond our ability to comprehend, right? And here's the idea that Nagel's suggesting, is that we have this cognitive dissonance dissonance, right? And we need to realize that we have a fact of experience, of the mind, of consciousness, and we have a conceptual schema, physicalism. These two don't play well together, but that's because maybe there are certain facts that go beyond our conceptual schema, right? And think about it, for instance. Think about the idea that, for instance, magnetism, right? We have a pretty good sense of what magnets are today, right? But think about if you go all the way back to when we talked about the pre-Socratics, we talked about Thales, right? And one of the things we mentioned is that Thales believed that magnets were alive. Why? Because when you put them close together, they seem to move. They seem to be self-animated. But of course, we don't believe that today. We see magnetism here as we can explain it given the conditions of essentially the electrical charges of certain sorts of chemical compounds, right? So we have a sophisticated explanation which explains it. Now, what we want to say here is that Thales had a conceptual schema which was religious in nature. He had certain facts, namely that magnets moved, and he was trying to apply that conceptual religious schema to include that fact, and it created a failure of reasoning. A rational dissonance, if you will. And this is ultimately the suggestion that Nagel's making here. We have this experience of consciousness, it's a fact, and our conceptual schema is just simply limited here. But since it is limited, that doesn't mean we just throw out the idea altogether of there being consciousness or reduce everything to the conceptual schema. We recognize, rather, we should, the limitations of the system. So, perhaps being a bat reaches beyond our conceptual schema, and we might even call it a supra-conceptual fact, right? Namely that there is such a thing as being a bat, so it's a I can't conceive of what it's like to be a bat, but I can say that since there are bats, there is such a thing, there's a fact of being a bat. But my conceptual schema can't get there. But here's the important thing, is that consciousness, though, for Nagel is not, I highlight, is not a private experience, right? So he doesn't think that consciousness is private, so it makes sense to say that I know what it's like to be you, because you're a human being. You have the same conditions of being, so I can understand, by analogy, the conditions that exist for your consciousness. But I can't do it for a bat because I don't have a conceptual schema good enough. And obviously, number two, I'm not a bat, right? But that doesn't mean that we should say that everyone is just in their own heads, right? That would automatically bring to bear the problem of solipsism, or the idea that all I am is my own mind. All that exists is my mind. And he wants to avoid that, right? He says rather consciousness may be seen here as a type of experience. There's an important distinction here. That's the distinction between type and token, right? You can talk about types of experiences, and then each type has multiple tokens or examples, right? So imagine, maybe the easiest way is to think about money, right? There's different types of money. You can have American money or you can have British money, right? And in American money, there's different tokens, right? Like the $5 bill, the penny with Lincoln's face on it, and so on and so forth. All of these are tokens of American money. But if you go to England, they have a different notes, right? They have the note has the Queen's picture on her. They have pounds for dollars. I mean, they have a whole different system. So they have different tokens for types. And his idea here is that maybe consciousness is a type. And when we talk about the physical body, that's also a type, right? And well, what this would mean here, because physicalism wants to say that consciousness is just a token of the physical type. And Nagel's suggestion here is, well, maybe there's such a thing as a physical type, but maybe consciousness is its own type as well. And my consciousness is different from the token of the bat's consciousness. So, but what this means here is that if consciousness is a type, it can never be illuminated by physicalism, because physicalism is a different type. So you can see here there's a categorical difference between consciousness in consciousness as such and physicalist type explanations, right? So let's sort of scroll down here. Oops, 12. Okay. Now, But what is it? But what's important here is that Nagel is committed to a common reality, right? So he's committed to science. He's committed to the idea that there's a common reality we're all inhabiting and existing in. But a common reality requires objectivity, which means precisely to move away from one's own particular point of view, right? So our goal is to get an objective sense of what consciousness is, but in order to do that, we'd have to not talk about our own perspective, our own point of view. And this means that physicalism, as we've mentioned, doesn't work. But it's not strictly false. It's just incomprehensible with this different type. They don't play nice together, if you will. So Nagel goes as far as to say, we might even say that the problem actually centers on the word is, what in logic is known as the copula, right? Because basically what the physicalist says is that consciousness is physical, right? And the problem here is when I make my X conscious and I make my Y physicalism, the problem is seems to refer to something seems to refer to how something is the case. But the problem is that reference point is completely misplaced in the question of physicalism and consciousness. And so what is his ultimate contention here? His contention is not that physicalism is false, but that we should put physicalism on hold. I just noticed that same spelling error. There we go. Is that we should put physicalism on hold. Or what he says here is that physicalism has the sound that matter. Physicalism today may have the sound that matter and energy would have had for the pre-Socratics, right? Today, we can understand when a scientist says that all matter is energy, right? This cup is matter, it's physical, but it's energy, right? We understand what that means because we understand what the periodic table of elements is. And we know that it's actually just a composition of energy, right? In a certain, distilled in a certain solid form, right? That's what we think the coffee cup is. But if I say that matter is energy today, that makes sense to us. But if I told Thales that, or if I told Anaximander that, they would not know what I was talking about. It would be completely foreign. And Nagel suggests that that's the problem with physicalism today. Physicalism today is just is that obviously there's something physical about consciousness because we're physical beings, but our conceptual schema is in its infancy today, to the point that it just sounds alien to us. We don't know what it means. So what we need to do here is we need to do more work on understanding the objective nature of our experiences. Because remember, what we want is an objective account of consciousness, right? But one which can answer the question of what is it like to be, what an experience is like. Which means that we have to begin to uncover what objectivity means for experience as such. Now, Nagel takes this as a big project that will probably take generations of philosophy to overcome. So he speculates that perhaps we should be able to develop a better way of describing these subjective states instead of simply using the mere analogy, right? Because that's what physicalism seems to rest on for him, is that it rests between the analogy of the mind and the body. And we need more than an analogy if we want an objective account. In this, he thinks, we haven't been able to give as yet. But that perhaps someday philosophy will be able to build up and articulate a more nuanced or evolved conceptual schema that actually could give us that account. But at this point, we don't have it. And so, as I've said, physicalism remains on hold. Okay, now that's essentially what we're looking at today. That's essentially his essay in What Is It Like to Be a Bat. It's not a rejection of physicalism as much as it's a suspension of physicalism. What I would say is that Nagel rejects the physicalist account, or he rejects that the physicalist account is sufficient. But he ultimately thinks that there's something to it, but we're just not there yet. As it were. So that raises some fairly interesting questions for us, because as we probe the question of the mind, what we realize is that we need a new and a different conceptual schema, one that would be able to give us that objective knowledge we're looking for. But as a result, all of the entire landscape of philosophy, of science, needs to change. And so you can see here he's something of he sort of projects out into the future. So it raises some pretty interesting questions. So anyway, that's our lesson today for what is it like to be a bat. I encourage you to take this red rose thought experiment as well as this what is it like to be a bat and go talk to it amongst your friends and your family and see what they think. What is consciousness? It's an incredibly important question, and it has huge ethical and and huge implications in, for instance, jurisprudence and this sort of thing. Think about, we often in the law will use the statement that you should act in a way that's rational, that any rational mind or any conscious rational person would act. So what does that mean, though? You can see here we don't have a good account, at least on Nagel's view, and that raises some pretty big questions for us. So I encourage you to keep thinking about this issue and sort of postulate what your view is to the comments on this video if you like. So thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys online. Okay, talk to you later. Bye.